there is a tendency for us to think about violence against women as something that happens over there. There's a tendency to think about violence against women as something that happens with people of a different skin color than us, or people of a different religion than us. And I just want to pause for a moment, because although this may have been what you expected to see, and I certainly do include it as what we call violence against women, I just want us to think a little more carefully about the sorts of things that happen in our culture, in North American culture, that also constitute violence against women. We are often horrified when we think about what happens in certain cultures in terms of the way in which girls are barred from education, the way in which women are forced to dress. We think about those often in the context of an idea we have about violence and its cultural implications. I often wonder, for example, about the position that we take in Western societies when we don't discuss the fact that one of the most significant optional forms of surgery that happens in North America, that has something like a 75% failure rate in terms of leakage, poisoning of the body, causing autoimmune diseases, and so on, is breast augmentation surgery. A significant invasive procedure that is performed on women, which nobody talks about in the context of invasive procedures against women, and yet we feel very comfortable about getting outraged when a woman chooses to wear a black piece of cotton on her head as a form of religious observance. I'm not making the point that I think that wearing a headscarf or not wearing a headscarf is inherently a good or a bad thing. I'm saying that the way in which we are often trained to think about these issues in a media context, where women are perceived in a certain way, where racialized women are perceived in a certain way, where religious minority women are perceived in a certain way, often clouds our judgment of and our understanding of how we perceive coercion of women and the way in which women in particular are treated, both in the media and in terms of our own understanding of how we filter images of violence against women. That Indigenous women were not only being sexually assaulted in a systematic manner, disappearing or being murdered, but their fate did not command any public attention for literally decades. One of the earliest such disappearances that's now on record is that of Margaret Yvonne Geely, the daughter of a woman who was expelled from the White Dog Reserve in Northern Ontario for getting involved with a non-Indigenous man. She lived in Toronto, raising 6 kids on her own, disappeared at 1965 at the age of 27. No missing persons report was ever filed. Her disappearance was brought to light by the work of Amnesty International Canada. I don't know if there's any Amnesty people here, but just want to nod. And by the Stolen Sisters Project, which Amnesty International was a significant supporter of. Might I add, if I may, that in 2010 the federal government cut the Stolen Sisters projects as part of the funding cuts as well. In 2007, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police started to update their lists of dead and missing women, many of whom are Indigenous, who vanished from Highway 16, the Highway of Tears I mentioned earlier. And now they're up to between 500 and 600 cases that have been documented of women who have been disappeared, missing, or murdered in that area. The Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is the UN body that's responsible for looking at treaty compliance with countries that have signed on to that treaty, is now considering an international commission of inquiry into the missing and murdered women phenomenon in Canada. That's the way we do things here. So in countries where I've traveled, where I've seen women treated in horrific ways, one of the countries I was working in one particular nation in Ethiopia, the woman must bring the meal to her husband every day walking on her knees. Because that is the way it's done. It didn't bother any of the people I spoke to. This is the way it is. This is the way it is done. This is culturally the way that it's done. And there are 100 examples, and they're not limited to other continents. But the fact of the matter is this is the way it's done. What do we know about violence against women? What have we learned, and what do we see in our own cultures that we either choose to ignore or unknow or unlearn because it isn't convenient to us? But the comparisons of crime rates around the country, as I said earlier, need to be taken with a grain of salt, in part because of the cultural issues I mentioned a while ago, but also because of the way in which the police deal with certain practices. In many jurisdictions, the police simply will not receive the crime of complaint of rape, and therefore necessarily you will not get the complaint. Also, in countries where they don't have the health infrastructure to prepare a rape kit, or even to deal with any of the medical consequences, they may deal with it as an assault, but not as a sexual assault either.